Welcome back. For those of you who are still enjoying your lunch, please don't stop on our account. That's the whole point, is to enjoy your lunch while Jason and I have a little chat. So appreciate you staying through lunch. So I hope it was good. I haven't been able to get there yet, but that's all right. So I want to welcome Jason. He was kind enough to accept our offer to come, and some of you may be thinking, oh my gosh, what is Jason doing at an EPSA event? And so for those of you that don't know him, that shouldn't surprise you. Jason accepted my offer before I even had a chance to fully describe what it was that I hoped to do. And he was very kind enough to say, I'd love to come. We should have the conversation. And so I appreciate you being here. We have a lot in common these days, more perhaps than we used to. So we want to talk through some of those issues. And so I hope you'll enjoy our conversation. I know I'm certainly looking forward to it. So let's do the perfunctory. You've been at your new role for a little over a year now. So you've got an impressive leadership team that you've assembled. How are things going? Any surprises or challenges? Anything that you didn't expect that you're now like, well, I guess I'm going to have to work on that you can share publicly?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Todd. I really am delighted to be here. I will note that I was wandering the hall with the Diet Mountain Dew and got some real harsh glares from the brain science people, so you might want to be careful about that. Let's see. So it has been a dynamic year for the clean energy transition. The American Clean Power Association is a pretty new operation, right? It was formed just a few years ago when I think a lot of the big companies looked around and said, look, we need to have a trade association that feels like API and EEI. We also want to have a multi-technology association, since just about all the major players had moved beyond kind of the single tech focus. So there is we jokingly say it was formed through like kind of a Game of Thrones process, and that we are now kind of putting together the shared feeling. So we're growing. I think we're at about 115 people. I think I've hired about 58 people since I started last year. And so this is just a reflection of just the incredible growth in the sector, but also the complexity of what we are working on. I think a focus on securing tax credits is incredibly important work, but it's a pretty focused exercise. Now that we are an industry at scale, we are confronting all of the same challenges and opportunities that every other part of the energy system has been grappling with. So I think you're seeing kind of the diversification of the way we do our work, from more focus on state and local work and markets and infrastructure, and we'll, I'm sure, talk some more. So I think that's, it hasn't been a surprise. Anticipating something happening and having it actually happen, though, are not necessarily the same emotional experience. A couple of things that I guess I would say are pleasantly surprising. The first is just how quickly the industry has kind of come together around the realization that we are just a core aspect of the American economy. We are a manufacturing association. I think we see ourselves as instrumental in a partnership with EPSA and every other association in town. I'm spending a lot of time with my peers in that regard, and there's been, I think, a really serious, we're just past kind of this taxation versus regulation. We're about, innovation and investment are actually pretty broadly accepted premises for American policy. And I think while the IRA process, which we'll talk about, was, let's just say the legislative process had a lot of ugly duckling, but the IRA is maturing into a beautiful swan. There is much more collective recognition and support for the basic efforts. So I think that's been encouraging. The thing I would say is surprising at a maybe high level, it's just all about federalism, right? Like at every place where we feel like we're crashing into a policy issue, at root, it is, I think, vested in the fact that we have an energy regulatory system designed 100 years ago when we used to have things called local power companies. And we now have energy issues that are at least regional. And though the scale and the size and the speed of that process are just crashing into local decision-making processes, which is in fact how the nation's been organized, right? Police power in the states, 10th Amendment. This is not to come in and want to bully local communities, but the mismatch between our needs and our decision-making structures comes back almost every day in some conversation.
Yeah, we talk about cooperative federalism and try to put the emphasis on cooperative, because that's how we're actually going to get something done, as opposed to the constant bickering. So this is clearly the section of some nerdy talk about energy, which is what these people are here for. So we're in good company.
I know some of them well enough to know that is true.
That's right. So there's been a lot of discussion around system reliability, system performance, the discussion this morning with the RTOs and with Jim Robb. There's red lights that are flashing. There are warning signs that are out there. It's broken through into the regular news cycle now, which tells you how important it is. How are you thinking about reliability, resource adequacy, and the role that your organization plays, much like we think about it from our perspective? Because as you and I talked as we were preparing for this, I think we share the responsibility for reliability pretty much equally is not the right term, but we both share part of that solution. So how are you thinking about some of those issues, and how's the organization responding to some of that?
We're going to have versions of this question probably for the next 25 minutes.
That's right.
Well, so first of all, just the absolute shocking expectations of growth in power demand, I think, have shaken the etch-a-sketcher, right? I think a lot of folks have been in kind of, trenched positions on, questions around resource adequacy and reliability that now is just kind of blown open. Beyond that, like, reliability is the #1 priority of anybody who works in the energy industry, right? When the power fails, the nation fails, the energy sector fails, all of our associations and members fail. So it's not a nice to have, right? It's an absolute. And without making kind of, metaphysical judgments about, the most important, we live in the moment, right? Pretty obvious statement, right? So if we have interruptions in power supply, that dominates and interrupts the trajectory of our energy policy goals, right? So it is obviously not in the interest of individuals, nor is it in the interest of the policy debate. And it's not a question about looking backwards, right? I think that we know what the solution looks like, right? The solution is dramatic scaling of non-carbon power that is 24/7, reliable, firm, and dramatic cleaning up of the fossil fuel supply and distribution and production chain. If we do both those things at once, we're good. Now, we know in the kind of clean power side, like, we know what our job is, right? It is dramatically scaling existing technology, bringing new technology like offshore wind online, which will obviously help with, system adequacy and durability. We obviously are making big strides in storage. I think last year, fourth quarter last year, built almost as much storage as we had built in any prior year. Got a long way to go. Fans of hydropower, really hoping that small modular reactors, show up in time to make a big difference. Transmission. Like, we need to do all of those things in order to have a plausible argument that we're going to be looking at 60, 70, 80% renewable power. I don't want to say you people, but like, the gas sector is going to have to do just the same, right? I mean, and not in like a casual, nice to have way. If we can achieve basically a near zero carbon gas system, natural gas is going to be around forever. And if we can't, it won't. And it's just a question of the pacing of those two things. We cannot replace something with nothing, right? We are going to have clean electrons at a level that is sufficient to power the country in a reliable way. Natural gas is going to continue to play an incredible, essential, it's a little bit kind of, demeaning to say, like, you need to play a supporting role since there's twice as much natural gas on the system as renewable energy. But, like, we're going to see that start to change. It's already starting to change. And the companies who are leading that change, right, the companies that are thinking about what that transition looks like and understanding how natural gas-based systems are going to evolve, not just to deal with things like CCS, but also to engage with new technology options like hydrogen, to the extent that the sector starts really thinking about the economics of, what the declining but essential role of dispatchable power is. I think those who are talking about a larger role for U.S. in terms of production and export of natural gas, so that we have a vibrant infrastructure and industry as the capacity factors start. Like, those are the companies that we're going to be talking to in 20 years. And I think many of them are in the room.
I'm glad you mentioned natural gas, Jason, because that's one of the things that you've been very forward about, your perspective on where the natural gas system is, its importance in ensuring reliability. And there have been a number of folks who've been, let's be diplomatic and say they've been critical of your perspective. You've explained kind of the whys and wherefores, and I think we'd agree on that. The system's changing, the resources are going to be utilized differently, but they're going to be kept around. There's going to be technologies deployed. We heard from CPV and GE about carbon capture and some of the technology that's available. Do you want to take a minute to expand on kind of why you view natural gas the way you do? Because the critics have been pretty sharp in their criticism. I don't think they've been especially fair to you in the comments that they've made,
That's okay. There's just a couple of them.
Right. But I think you raise the issues that I think where there is commonality. I mean, in a surprise to no one probably in this room, we have a number of common members. That wouldn't have been the case several years ago, but that is the case today. So I'm just kind of offer a little bit of color around that to help people maybe walk back from the ledge a bit and realize that, you know, there is an opportunity for all resources to participate.
And so I think my most oft-repeated statement when I was at the Bipartisan Policy Center was, when you look back at the last 20 years of energy climate policy, it's fair to say that, you know, conservatives have been challenged by science and progressives have been challenged by math. Right? As we're talking about the solution, the speed and the scale of this challenge is unlike anything that we've ever confronted before. And, you know, I mean, with the idea that we're fighting about, you know, do we want 80 or 90 or 100% non-carbon power at a moment when we have, you know, less than half of that, I think it's just not the right argument, right? We are moving faster than ever before to deploy clean power. You know, the most clean power deployed last year than ever before. You guys probably know some of these numbers, but, you know, 34, almost 35 gigawatts, over 20 of solar, you know, significant expansion on the battery side. You know, onshore wind had a tough year, but, like, you know, system is working, and we can talk about the IRA, but we need to be deploying probably 3 or 4 times that in order to actually have a system that has the capacity to, you know, power the economy and meet our climate goals. And so, like, we like to talk, you know, the beginning of the transition is exciting, the end of the transition is exuberant, the middle's really tough, and we're in the middle. And we can't wish away key aspects of our energy system. So, you know, I just think it's, you know, it's not a controversial statement if you have any affinity to engineering or math to say that we are not on target to achieve a zero carbon grid in 11 years. But it is not an excuse, or I think what people get confused is when you tell the truth, they think you're either being courageous or you're suggesting complacency. It's just the truth. And recognizing that we are not on track is, of course, what, if you care about getting there, should argue that we need to be more aggressive, right? That's why we need a profoundly different understanding about how we're going to do permitting and building linear infrastructure. It's why we have to actually consider, you know, not beyond the existing policies, additional policies that we're going to need to have if we're going to actually move at that scale. So, you know, look, I think that it is, the climate debate has been, for the last 20 years, you know, dominated mostly by the loudest fighters, and we've built a, you know, advocacy infrastructure, you know, think tank industrial complex around that battle, and many people who've been, you know, and the future's going to be around the builders and the fixers, and that can really antagonize the people who have become really good at fighting. And so I think we're seeing that, and it's a, you know, and yeah, they're occasionally mean to me.
That's all right, I'm in good company. So I want to come back to one of the comments that Julie made, because you raised that now. It's like just telling the truth. I mean, we have to be honest with the public about the system and when and how, and then the issue of cost is one of the things, and I think if I didn't quote Julie correctly, she'll correct me, but that we've told people it will cost less and less, and yet it seems to cost more and more. And so the quickest way to lose public support is for them not to trust you on the issues that are really important. So as we're experiencing significant turnover and operational differences to the system, and as the RTO panel this morning talked about, the load growth numbers are pretty staggering. I thought I knew what they were. They were actually even larger than what I've been reading, and I think they've probably got the best data. And then there's transmission that will need to be built out to go with some of these additional resources to get the supply to the load centers. What are your thoughts about how we keep costs in check, or how do we best mitigate it? We have a pretty clear philosophy here. We think shifting it off of ratepayers and onto shareholders and investors is the best way to do that. But kind of how do you and your organization think about it, and how are you trying to implement some of that? And that'll, of course, lead us into some IRA discussion. But I just kind of want to set that up to, how are you thinking about affordability issues?
So, you know, we all have the same affordable, reliable, clean, secure, clean, affordable, reliable, secure. Like, a little bit of like kind of like a Rorschach test, like what order you put those in terms of what industry you're representing at the moment. I think that we know how this goes, right? Like when it comes to secure, that's, you know, renewable sector, natural gas, I mean, everyone's pretty well, like, good news, we are domestic energy suppliers. That's frankly the easiest of the four in the narrow terms. Reliable and clean are they're just absolutes, right? Like, neither of those are optional. What gets squeezed is cost. It just does, I think, and it happens, when power is $5,000 a megawatt in Texas and $20, 100 miles away, like, that's an affordability problem. So there's an affordability issue that is very much connected to the whole reliability question, right? It is those extreme events where people suffer the most. And I think the question of how we socialize the cost of this transition is the right question for a democracy. There are limits, right? I think that we all know that if we get to a point where energy is actually not affordable for the kind of working class American economy and the manufacturing sector, we're going to slow down the transition. We just will, and that would be a tragedy for all kinds of larger global reasons. So how we mitigate that, I think, I'm not going to give you the precise equation. I do think, again, it gets a little bit back to we at least got to do the best stuff out there, right? So we do have opportunities. Go back to transmission just as one example. There are some really, really smart transmission investments that will lower the collective cost of energy for a region. But no single decision-making body in that region gets to see the full benefits of that decision, right? So, I mean, we do have to think through, we can go market failure for a minute. Like, we do have market failures in our decision-making process that we're going to have to optimize for. And then the, last part of this answer is there's costs on both. There's costs going too fast and there's costs going too slow. And I think that it is important that obviously, those of us who are focused on providing the energy today, our incentive structure is to focus on the cost of going too fast. We can't forget the cost of going too slow, because they're pretty tragic and pretty profound. And I'm pretty convinced that if you actually added them up dollar for dollar, they're a lot bigger. And so I think, it is important also just in terms of, you're talking about kind of consumer acceptance. We also all have a social license issue. And I think that one of the biggest risks is that the incumbent industry is seen as trying to slow walk the solution. And you lose credibility on that side of the equation too. And then nothing else you say about near-term costs or reliability gets listened to. So, my advocacy is that, those of us on the renewable side need to put reliable first, and folks on the fossil side need to put clean first. And we've both got to lean into our weaknesses, not just brag about our strengths.
And I know our board has talked about this at some length, about how we need to get there from here. And there is universal agreement that we want to get to the policy outcomes that policymakers say they want us to get to. The timelines are the issue. Yeah. And there's a way to do it right and to do it thoughtfully, and then there's the way that in many places we're doing it right now, and that is creating some of those pushbacks. I look back to many moons ago, when I was on the commission, and we did some polling and said, how comfortable are you paying more for transitioning to a different fuel set, and gave them all sorts of options. And most people are pretty agnostic, less than $10 a month. 10 seems to be a magic number that when you hit that, now this is dated data, so take this with a grain of salt.
With inflation, that's about $150.
Well, not quite that much, but something like that. But that's when you saw the drop-off start to happen. And of course, the early adopters are somewhat agnostic, and so it does bear, like, we've got to think about that. I think you framed it in an interesting way for us to think about is, sometimes we like to talk about what we're really good at, but let's think about how to balance that with some of the things that need addressing in order to cover that other delta. That's a separate delta. So the IRA was kind of a big deal, and some would have called, like Obamacare, kind of a big deal. But it had profound impacts on support for certain resources and what will and won't be added to the system. It created some real economic pressures on generating resources that aren't getting subsidies or don't get a tax credit or benefit under the IRA. How are you thinking about the appropriate balance between resources that are receiving some form of additional compensation versus those that are not, but are needed to ensure reliability? And natural gas is the one that we all talk about, because gas is the part of the system that can respond quickest. As Jim Robb said at a different forum, he said, it's not that I love gas, I love what it can do for the system. Sure. If you have another resource that can do what gas can do for me, our folks would be building it. So I think that's one of the issues, just to make sure people are clear. What's ACP's view? What's your view in thinking about how we're having to navigate through the disparity between resources that are receiving some additional support and those that aren't but are needed to keep the lights on. As you said, this comes back to that reliability question. I mean, that's critically important.
So, the focus of the IRA incentives were to accelerate the transition to low carbon power, right? I mean, if you were going to say what was the overarching purpose of that legislation, it's working, right? I mean, I think at least, we can talk about whether the goals were, broad enough, but against that goal, we have seen this idea of a stable, tax incentive environment inspiring private investment to be working very well. We've had about almost $500 billion of announced private sector investment just in the last 17, 18 months. We have 128 new domestic manufacturing facilities, which I think is going to be core to the political durability and economic durability of the law. We are obviously having the greatest deployment of clean power. So I mean, I think just first principles, like it's doing what it was intended to do. I also think the reason it passed was because the Congress actually had a pretty broad imagination of the energy system. While the process itself was incredibly toxic politically, right? You don't get a more alienating process than the reconciliation process, and every party thinks they get to use it once or twice when they win an election. The reality is the IRA was basically providing the capacity to implement the legislation that Senators Murkowski and Manchin led in 2020, which was a broad-based technology incentive approach that focused not just on the classic renewables, but also on nuclear and CCS, and I think a much broader suite of technologies. And that was an authorization bill with no appropriation. The IRA is essentially that appropriation. So I think that there is quite a bit of actual support for the law, much broader than might have been imagined at the moment. And just not to let any secrets, like we're having lots of conversations with just about every energy trade association you've ever heard of. No one wants to repeal the IRA, right? So I think there's many people who want to improve it, including ACP. I think if I go Johnny Cochran, you got to be able to defend it before you can amend it, right? So the first thing is just to make sure that we actually kind of take the remaining political toxicity out of that debate. And look, to the question about subsidy envy is not a very becoming look, right? Like the subsidization, the only free market are illicit markets, right? So I've seen for years and years as you have people arguing about intangible drilling costs and the cost of the Fifth Fleet and the Price-Anderson Act for nuclear. And so, I mean, I think that there is an impossible mathematic, but also not very productive question to figure out whose subsidies are bigger. I do think that we now have a policy that is trying to accelerate clean power in a way that is so fast that the market's not going to get us there, absent considerable public policy push. Right? If we had 100 years for the clean energy transition, the natural market technology advancement would get us there. We're trying to do it in 35 years. And so I think we feel confident that the investments are good investments. If there are other investments that the nation needs to make sure that there is reliability supporting the IRA, like we should talk about those other investments. I think we're going to have much more energy infrastructure. I think it's, the clean energy future is going to require a lot more pipes than we have right now. They're not all going to be pushing hydrocarbons, but there is a broader set of energy policies that I think are going to be necessary, which, if they're done well, will also enhance reliability.
Yeah, and I think there's independent voices that are saying similar things that are not you in your book or us in our book or pick your association in their book. But EIA talks about the number of additional megawatts that will be needed, the additional amount of natural gas that will be needed, even in a high renewables penetration scenario. I mean, the numbers are pretty staggering. And yes, they'll operate differently. It won't be an 8760 system. But as I think Jim and a couple of the other panelists mentioned, those 4 or 5 days a year, which could be 20 days at some point, that's mission critical. Absolutely. It's the lights being out or the lights being off. Yep. So it's going to require a paradigm shift. And I think Julie was talking about that when we talked before lunch about ways we're going to have to think about this differently in order for us to achieve that outcome. And I think that's important. And so you've done a great job of teeing up my next question, which is, at the risk of sending people screaming from the room, is there a way for incumbents and the renewables community to collaborate to ensure reliability? What else could we be doing? We've started to try to work together on some things. If you had your magic wand, or I forget what the example was this morning, but what would you have us do in order to try and help make this process a little less adversarial and a little more collaborative?
Doesn't look like a crowd of screamers, I got to tell you. So I guess I question the premise a little. Like, I think we've actually moved a lot farther along the way than in some way.
I'd agree. We've made progress.
I mean, I was telling someone, it feels like, we all woke up and we were on the same team in a three-legged race, right? Which is but we're running in the same direction now. It's clumsy. When one of us falls down, we take the other one down with us, right? So I think there is that sense of the energy sector is all in this together. Like, there's not a single energy technology that can succeed if the others are failing. And if we acknowledge that, and I think we've all got to try to get a little less defensive, right? Like, renewable technologies are intermittent. That is different than not reliable, but they're intermittent. Like, this is not a surprise to anybody. And the ability of the, clean energy companies that I'm working with, or at least, I should step back. Like, some people don't understand, like, ACP is, as Todd was saying, some of the largest utilities in the country, international integrated oil and gas companies. 2/3 of the renewable power deployed last year was deployed by companies that also have fossil and nuclear assets. So this whole, there's Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader, and it's just not the reality. Whether we want to be or not, we are actually all intermingled in the economics of the transition. And so I think, just trying to change the entrenched expectations of what we all believe requires us to all be proactive with our own communities, right? It's why, I think the clean power sector deserves some credit for having more direct conversations with the climate advocacy community about whether the, discussion of the problem is being met by a commitment to the solution. I think that, the same thing has to happen and is happening with the, leading oil and gas companies. So I'm giving you more of a kind of a spiritual mood mix, but I would end it this way, which is 20 years ago when Congress could reconcile differences, we all had the luxury to be petty, right? We could all just push our own books and go forwards and advocate for things whether we really believed them or not, and just try, Congress would find a way to metabolize and address those differences in the service of national policy. That's not happening now, right? So we actually don't have the luxury of that kind of rigidity. The only way we're going to have coherent national policy is if the energy industry, in some broad sense, can come together and say, this is what we think the future needs to look like. And not on a platter, but at least, create the, table of contents for what energy policy needs to be. And then, we can work together to argue about the details. But I feel like there is a sense of, if not us, who, that I'm seeing across the industry, which I think is a probably productive place to be.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I don't have the greatest confidence that the Congress is able to do what they used to do and pass legislation that would be effective. So, do you want to talk permitting and siting? We didn't talk about this ahead of time, but boy,
Yeah.
It feels like it's ripe for discussion given all the other things that we're talking about.
Yeah, my favorite blues singer, Howlin' Wolf, has a song, "I'm built for comfort, baby, I ain't built for speed." Pretty good description of the U.S. approach to, imagining the future. We have people working very hard in a structure that is incapable of success, right? The innovations we need in democracy are far greater than the innovations we need in technology if we're going to actually move forward. And so that's at and the permitting legislation that's being talked about now is constructive. I think what Congress and the White House did in the debt ceiling debate was constructive, but it's nibbling, right? I think that we're going to have to, over the course of the next 10 or 15 years, probably have 3 or 4 significant pieces of federal legislation that start to reorient these processes. And again, it comes back to collaborative federalism. We're not going to, this country is, we were forged in antipathy to monarchy, right? This is not a country that goes first to big federal plenary preemptions. It's just not the way we're ever going to operate. And we have to acknowledge that we're going to need some more regional and more centralized decision making. We can't just hope that 150 small independent decisions are going to somehow lie. I mean, electrons move much faster than even the best public servants, right? So we're going to have to think about this differently. In the near term, we think that there's 4 corners of a legislative package that we are working on, and it has a obviously focus on meaningful reforms to enable transmission build, particularly the kind of interregional transmission that connects those seams up. We're going to need a similar focus on improving the efficiency of the siting of linear infrastructure for the oil and gas sector. So the wires and pipes metaphor is true, but details matter. I think there's a strong agreement that we need some kind of reform of the judicial review process, not to diminish public access, but to make that public access consistent with the timescales that we need to actually succeed as a country. And I think there's going to be something around critical minerals and mining. I think those will be probably the four corners of legislation that could pass. The last thing I will note, though, going back to this idea of why the energy industry has to come forward, there's no committee in Congress that has the jurisdiction that is broad enough to put that deal together.
Right.
People misunderstand how important congressional jurisdiction is, especially when you're trying to do contentious political deals. So we're going to need one of those gangs. It is worth noting that when members of Congress decide they want to work together, they call themselves a gang, right? It's give you a little bit of a sense of the violence in the process. But so I think, if we can come together as an industry and lay out that framework, that will then give them the capacity, I think, to pull the folks together who have a chance of moving it forward. We're thinking about, the first 9 months of 2025, but I feel like we have to kind of lay down the outlines of what that looks like now to have a shot at hitting that window.
Yeah, I think that the Jets and the Sharks is a good analogy. And I used to work for a governor that often said, you have to plow the field before you think you're going to get some outcome. And we would share that assessment that you can't just walk in and expect that people are going to take up your issue immediately if they don't understand the whys and the wherefores. So Jason, we are out of time, but thank you very much for being willing to come and chat with us and for your candid comments and really a great discussion around what sounds like an awful lot more in common than maybe the average outsider would think that there is, because I think we agree that we share responsibility for reliability and we both want to get it right, as do our organizations. So thank you very much for that.
Appreciate it.
Join me in thanking Jason.